Paul, actually, we have here right now, joining James Taylor for a discussion on decision modeling and advanced automation.
All right. Okay, am I on? All right. Well, thanks everybody who's still here.
Still here,
Maybe
yeah.
save the best for last. So we'll prepare for an entirely unscripted impromptu chat with James around the business of decision engines and decision modeling solutions. So, I mean, we were working together a few times before in the past, James, and you obviously do have a certain set of skills acquired over a lifetime. You've literally written a book on decision management. But tell us, like, what is decision modeling? What does your company do? Why are you working with us?
Yeah, so we specialize in helping people adopt and use decision engines, right? So we're focusing on taking a business decision they have to make, typically in high volume, quickly and accurately, and automating it using a modern decision platform. And we've been doing this 15 years or so now, and we've worked with some very, very large companies, we've worked with some very small ones. We have people pick decision engines, configure them, we host them for some clients. And in that journey, we come across a number of Inovatec customers. We've worked with you at a couple of at an account, we've worked with a couple of others, and we've implemented decision engines that plug into their Inovatec framework. And so we've become an Inovatec partner because that's we see that as a real opportunity, because there's one of the things in decisioning is how do you get the data that you need to make a decision with. So we're often working with people who've got terrible legacy systems and just crappy data, and it's in terrible places. And when we work with Inovatec, all the data's in Inovatec. We say we're working with APIs, so it's very easy for us to build decision engines. So, yeah, so for us, this is it's a great place to bring our skills to build these decision engines and plug it into the process framework.
Excellent. And one thing I should have mentioned at the outset, we welcome questions throughout the presentation. So just flag down Brian or anybody at any point in time if you want to kind of pop in with your own question. I will start. So I think like a common point of confusion here would be what is new about this, right? Like certainly in prime, increasingly in non-prime, most lenders will have some level of automation, if A then B, sort of actions. How is a decision model in a decision engine different or better than that?
Sure. So what we see when people generally, when they start with that, they're using workflow, they're using code elements inside their process framework. And what we see is they tend to focus first and foremost on ordered clients, because those tend to be easier to define. They tend to still leave a very high percentage of their approvals to be manual. So there's still a lot of work to do to approve all these things, and some of them are, the consistency issues, all the things you get when you have manual approvals. And they tend not to have terribly nuanced logic. So they might have, if it's less than this threshold, we'll say no. If there's this other threshold, if it's above that, we'll say no. What if it's nearly above that and nearly below that? Well, then we have a manual review, right? And so there's not a lot of, the gray areas are left out of the decision. And then some of them try really to sort of push on that. They really try to really get into the weeds, but they stay in the workflow. And then you get this explosion of complexity. So you get decision trees and flows that just go on and on and on and on. You can like wallpaper the room with them because they're so long. And they don't lend themselves to change. They become very static. They become very hard to add a new product. I want to add a new product, and people just go, like copy the whole tree and these things. So they become a barrier to innovation because, yes, they're there, they've got all this complexity, but they're hard to change and they're fragile. And so decision engines really sort of trying to address those things, by giving you the best of both worlds. You get a much more sophisticated decision, but you also get it in a way you can manage.
Right. Maybe just give us an example here. So decision tree is something everyone's familiar with. We have that capability in our system, many use it. Sometimes it's appropriate, but maybe just help us understand, like if somebody in the room here is working off a decision tree, how do they kind of know that now might be the time to start thinking about something more sophisticated? How would that work? What would the benefits be?
Sure. So generally what we see is that, particularly with decision trees, right, you have to pick what you're going to branch on all the time. And so what you find is you start repeating yourself. Because at the beginning I say, well, are you buying this kind of product or this kind of product or this kind of product? Or what terms you have. You've got to pick something to branch on first. And then as you work your way down the tree, you end up in the same logic appearing in several places. Well, now you've got to make sure it's consistent and everything else. So the whole thing starts to get overly large. So if you find yourself reluctant to make a change because it's a lot of work to figure out where the change is, or if you find yourself having to do something like, say, well, I've got to go find all the places I have to change this threshold, that's a bad sign. That means you're repeating yourself more than once in the logic, right? So what we generally see is it's too hard to make a change, takes me too long. I'm not able to put a very fine-grained, very nuanced decision into my decision tree. It's a little bit lumpy. I've got too much gray area that's being referred for manual review. And the other thing I would say is that there's a lack of data about what happened, because I tend to push you down a branch fairly quickly, and then if you go down branch A, I'm going to say no. I never know anything else about you. Whereas the panel was just about reject influence, right? If I know I'm going to say no because you're trying to buy the kind of car I don't support, so I branch you out, or maybe I don't run any of the other logic. So, well, what kind of buyer would you have been had you been trying to buy a car that I would have lent money against? You lose that visibility into what's really going on.
And so what kind of decision cycles are enabled if you run a properly designed decision engine backed by a decision model? Like, are we talking weekly, monthly?
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, we certainly, I would say the most common we see is probably a monthly cycle. But in high change periods, when you've got just brought out a new strategy, or you're just focusing on a new product, you might need weekly change cycles. And you ought to be able to change it the same day if you need to. Right? So, you get a call from the authorities saying, we've got this new kind of fraud, or we've got this concern, or there's something happened. A dealer calls up and says, we've got someone who's been messing with the system, you should ignore all our applications for today, or whatever it might be. You can go in and just immediately make a rule change. So you need to have that immediate responsiveness. That's something you will be able to get. But you should certainly be able to have a regular cadence where you're updating the thing on a regular basis. And not just like little changes, but like really thinking about, I want to make it possible to target this new group of people with this new product. I'm going to make a set of changes for that, and have that be something you can do as part of a monthly change cycle. We often encourage people to say, well, how often do you think you would like to change it? And then set up a change cycle that's faster than that. Because what you want to be able to do is say, I don't have a change to make today, so I'm not going to make one. Right. But you want to have that regular checking. So if you want to make monthly changes, have a weekly check. If you want to make quarterly changes, have a monthly check. You won't necessarily always make a change, but you get that opportunity to choose what that change cycle looks like.
Right. What about portfolio analytics reporting, that sort of thing? Right. You've set it up in a decision engine, decision model versus more traditional approach.
Yeah, well, one of the things about a decision model is it's this visual blueprint of your decision making. So it takes the overall decision, it breaks it down into a lot of pieces, sub-decisions and sub-decisions. So you've got all these building blocks of your decision. And when you implement that in a modern decision engine, you record all those things about your transactions. So you can say, well, for anyone I decided, I know what their loan-to-value ratio was, except for an I know what their TSA, all these sub-decisions get recorded for every single loan you run through, and every application you run through. Regardless of what you said at the end, whether you said yes, no, or maybe, right, you have this rich set of data about why you did that. And that enables you to do some interesting things. You say, well, how many people did I say no to, even though they could have afforded the loan because they were in a province I don't support, or there was something else about them. And I can see what kinds of people fell out for different reasons. But I can also tie that then into my outcomes. So we were just talking about fraud, right? So how did I decide to lend money to all the people who didn't make their first payment? So I can just say who didn't make their first payment. I can go see exactly how I decided to lend them the money and go, okay, do they look like a typical cross-section of my customers, or is there something about them that I could have told at the moment I was lending it? Now I can go tweak my decision model, change my implementation, and stop lending it to people who aren't going to make the first payment.
Right, where, if it's a decision tree, it might be branch 3A, 5E, blah, blah, blah.
And if it's a manual, if it was a manual process, right, you might get everyone together and say, these are the people, does anyone remember how that process went, right? But it's not as it's a typically less robust analysis process.
Right.
So you get this big increase in sort of data richness about the decisions you make, and exactly how you make them.
Right. So, I mean, if anyone's sort of thinking this is making sense, maybe I too should get a decision engine. Like, what does this involve? What do people have to be prepared for?
So, I mean, obviously, the key thing with any decision automation is going to be volume, right? That you need to have a certain amount of volume that makes it worth your while to implement, to go through the exercise of figuring this out. Well, generally, it involves a couple of steps. So, the first thing we will do is, come talk to the people who make the decision today. So, who decides today that you're going to lend pool money? Okay, well, someone does, right? So, how do they do that? And try and turn that into a decision model. We often joke that our expertise is in taking what you know how to do and turning it into a model we can implement in software. We're not necessarily advising you that you're choosing the right loans. We just, how do you do it? Let's represent that in a way we can successfully. Now, if you have a decision engine, a lot of those of you who are parts of big banks, you will certainly have one. Some of you have decision engines. Then we just go ahead and implement it on whatever that engine is. And if you haven't got one, we can help you pick one, or we can host one for you. We have a couple of customers we just host the engines for. And then go ahead and implement that decision model in the engine so that you have this sort of visual blueprint that was agreed by the business owners. And it looks very much like implementation. So there's a very low impedance between what you thought you were going to get and what the engine does. There's not a lot of code hiding all that logic. And then it's a matter of plumbing it in. Obviously, the plumbing with Inovatec is straightforward because we just have an API. But then there are all the sort of that rich data set that has to be put somewhere, where you can match it to your loans. And so there's a sort of data reporting piece of this. So we go through that. Now, how much of that? It really depends on how custom you want it to be, right? If you're a subprime lender, you've got very custom logic, and you're defining exactly how those 200 segments within the subprime bucket work for you. Well, then obviously there's a lot of custom logic that we're capturing from your team, right? If on the other hand you want something just a little bit more complicated than that would be standard in Inovatec, well then that's a much more straightforward proposition because we already know what that looks like as a decision, right? And then we've done enough of these now that you can this can be a consulting arrangement, but it can also be very similar to what you guys charge per loan kind of arrangement. So it's all back in pricing.
Right. Yeah. And so what do people have to be prepared for practically? I mean, Daniel shared with us, earlier, what resonated with me, the 75-page credit policy.
Yes.
Right? These things evolve over time. You got branches in here, so on and so forth. Like if you're getting ready to make this jump, do you start with what you already have? Do you start with a fresh slate? Like how would you encourage people to prepare for this?
So I mean, so first of all, we always try to start with what you do today, right? We want to make it easy for you to change it, adapt it, but we don't want to. But we typically want to start with how you make the decisions today. We try not to make too many changes to your risk strategy out of the gate. That's not the intent. If you've got risk strategy, the strategy documents, so we'll always start with those because that's really what you're trying to implement. That's part of the logic here. We just encourage people not to write new ones because what we found is that traditional requirements documents don't lend themselves to decision engines very well. You end up with long lists of rules that can't be checked against each other, and then they contradict themselves because on page 73 you said this, and on page 5 you said that. And so we try and start with the documents that are already written. Don't write any new ones. Try and build a decision model. And some of our customers now, we're starting to replace those strategy documents that say here's how the risk strategy should be implemented with a decision model. Right. So we're like. We had one recently, and they had I think 8 pages of text and an 11-tab Excel spreadsheet describing a particular element of the risk strategy. Well, when you turn that into a decision model, it fits on a single PowerPoint slide. So, we're working with those teams to say, well, let's stop writing these documents. Let's not have that be how you describe a change. Let's refine. Let's use the models as a touchstone. And we've had some success with that in some of our accounts where they've started to change their mindset from what documents can I write to let's argue about the model.
Right. Yeah, okay. And then you talked about some best practices. What about some worst practices to avoid? Maybe that's a longer list.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of them, right? I think the biggest one for us is, it's generally if you're building any kind of automation, it's not a great strategy to write a law requirements document and throw it over the fence.
Right.
And we found that's a particularly poor strategy with decision engines, because you've generally got both business and risk. And you end up with this very long, very complicated document that's written by a sort of different groups of people, and it's not a great way of specifying it. So, we would always try to build a decision model instead. The second thing we would say probably is that if you have that kind of stuff, you implement it directly, you end up with what we sometimes jokingly call the big bucket of rules problem. You've got all the rules and they all work, but they're really just some undifferentiated mass in the decision engine. So you can't really find them and change them. It's hard to know what the impact of the change is going to be. So you need some way to structure that, actually, one of these decision models. And then I guess the other one is really, we see companies, they're buying a decision engine. Part of what they want to get out of the decision engine is this ability to make rapid changes. But then they plan to get everything into version 1 and then make no changes for 18 months. And we're like, why would you buy a decision engine that's easy to change and then plan not to change it, right? So you want to sort of try and plan from the very beginning that you're going to be making changes. We often tell clients, some of them were in the room, they've heard me say this before, it's not about version 1, it's about version 101. How do you create that environment where you can continually improve your engine, continually improve its behavior, add new products, add new thresholds, add new data, add new scores, and keep refining it on an ongoing basis. So you have to plan that way. That's what you're thinking about when you start the engine, not kind of get all the rules in version 1, declare victory, and light off the lessons. So, yeah.
And what would you consider to be the boundaries of automation? Like, do you see a place for manual adjudication? Like, if so, where is it? Like, where do you?
Sure.
Yeah.
So when we work on this, we try and take a fairly holistic view of the decision. Right? We want to look at the whole decision and try and capture as much of it as possible in the automation. Because one of the things we found is that people often assume certain things are going to be too complicated or too nuanced to put into the rules, right? And decision models, because they break the problem down into lots of small pieces, often allow you to get a lot further into the weeds than people think they're going to be able to get. So we like to sort of take a sort of maximalist view of that. Well, what could we automate, right? How far could we go? What can be done? And then back off when we find the decisions that we're like, really, we want that to be a human judgment, right? And a lot of those come down to things like whether there's a conversation or there's an interaction, and it's just not, there isn't, you can't define a clear set of boundaries, right? So when there's an income source that maybe it has to be discussed. How reliable is your archives, revenue stream, kind of thing. Right? So there's elements of that, and so we would say, what's interesting for me, these is I've done systems for identical companies where it's like the identical decision. One of them basically has 100% manual review. Every transaction goes to a person, and the other person had 99% automation. And as far as you define the business problem, they were identical. But there was a business style. They wanted you to have someone to talk to, they wanted to have a person, they wanted that interaction, and the other guys wanted you to get a mobile app, you get a yes, right? So, in the end, it comes down to when do you want to have someone talk to somebody else or interact with the data, much more than can you automate. Think about all these new data sources, the new analytics, machine learning, the way a decision model lets you manage complex rules. There's very little you couldn't automate. It's really a question of when you want to.
Right.
Where you come.
And I suppose the more you automate, the more investment there is in monitoring the model,
Yes.
seeing if you need to change it, this sort of thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, getting people to change can be kind of hard. And particularly what we find, we've had some great chats with some of the folks doing new data sources, new scores, and so on. Adding new data, adding new scores into a manual process can be very difficult because you've got to get people to rethink how they make the decision. And they've got a lot of habit. They've looked at lots of lines. They've decisioned lots of lines a certain way. Now you're asking them to add in a new trade-off, do this complex trade-off between things. So if you're going to automate more of that, it's often easier to bring in those, you know, those trade-offs, those comparisons, because you can be explicit. Right?
Yeah. And you know, the thing that most of us think about when we're talking about automation is the credit decision. Typically, it's some sort of binary yes, no, or maybe manual review. You know, there are other possibilities. There's, you know, management of collections, recovery, small management system, potentially pricing. What are some of the other use cases people might want to be thinking about in terms of automating decisions?
Sure. So what we often say to people, so anytime you have a relatively high volume transactional interaction where it's not immediately obvious what you should do, then there's an opportunity to automate that decision. So in collections, the classic one is early stage treatment is a classic one. Do I let someone self-correct? Do I nudge them? Do I go immediately? How do I react to that? Then there's the sort of, as you get further into recovery, it's like, well, which ones do I try and recover? Which ones do I pass off to somebody else? If I've got perhaps multiple recovery partners, how do I pick who gets which one? So there's all those sort of like downstream decisions that I might inject some of my stuff to. Who do I restructure? Some of those kinds of proactive things. In multi-line businesses, you get the cross-sell, upsell, you know, who's in the market for something else. Coming up to term, how to get them to buy another one, all those kind of decisions. And then you get, there's a set around, if you manage some of those other loan management processes, you know, how do you decide who you're going to send to the group car? How do you decide, who you're going to assign to tasks? There's another classic. As soon as you have a large pool of people who have to be assigned, and that's not just your loan people, it's everybody downstream. Then again, there's an opportunity to say, who am I going to assign this to? How do I assign? What's my logic for assigning?
Okay, one more question for me, and then I'm going to try to prompt the audience here. So maybe start thinking about questions I'd like to ask. But you know, at the end of the day, we're business people. What's the sort of, I know every lender's different, but directionally, what's the sort of ROI that somebody can sort of expect from making this transition?
Right. I mean, you and I have talked about this a lot, right?
Yeah.
So one of the big debates. I mean, I think that the key thing for us is really to focus on both the sort of top line and the bottom line improvements. Right? There is a lot of evidence. You guys presented some Propel, right? But if you auto adjudicate, if you say yes, auto manage, you get higher rates of acceptance. I think one example was somewhere from 45 as the standard rate to about 55, right? So that's a big increase in funded loans for the same risk strategy, right? You get more loans because you're getting in front of people and they're saying yes, and you're saying yes quicker, right? I think there's a sense that we get from folks that they worry about being adversely selected against when they're swap. Right? If you've got a group of people in the same risk tier, well, who are the people most likely to get automated offers from your competitors? Well, the best risks in that bucket. So if you take a long time to come back, by the time you get back, the people who are left are the ones who weren't obviously going to get a good offer from someone. And so you're tending to drift down. In each segment, you're tending to be concentrated at the bottom because they're the ones who are left after the early auto adjudication. So you get adverse selection. So those two things really affect your sort of top, right? Because you can be more, you can manage more complexity with a model decision engine. You can be more fine-grained. And so not only does that mean you're less likely to be adversely selected because you've got three risk segments for every one of your competitors, you also now can enforce your risk policy in a more fine-grained, more consistent way. So you can see lower losses because you're not making, if you like, errors of consistency or errors of judgment because it's much more structured. And then there's a cost reduction. You're not having to look at as many deals, and so that's a straight up. Same number of people can handle a larger loan portfolio because they don't have to look at as many deals, right? And that varies a lot. Sometimes the deals you're automating are ones that wouldn't have taken long to manually improve, but sometimes that's not true. Sometimes it's actually the ones that are easiest to automate next are ones that would actually have been quite slow to review. Right? You can save a lot of time.
Excellent. Great. All right. So, who has a question for James? There must be someone.
There we go.
Amy.
All right. Uh-oh. I didn't say oh. I never say oh.
Can you hear me? It is on. Okay. So one thing you had mentioned, James, was not developing all the rules in the beginning and being prepared to sort of iterate frequently over time to refine your solution. I think that makes sense, but what I am wondering is how do you avoid over-engineering the solution, but still avoid having gaps in your strategy by
Right.
doing it that way?
So it's a good question. What I would say is that generally when we see the iterations, there's two aspects to it. The majority of iterations are about making the decision engine match your risk strategy more closely. So you have a risk strategy that's defined, and you have some area of it where you're like, if you're in this area of the risk, we're referring it to manual review. And then gradually you're refining the logic to make those gray areas smaller and smaller. But you're not really changing the risk strategy, right? So in those cases, that's a relatively safe kind of change. It doesn't need a lot of, as long as you have a well-defined set of rules, it's easy to make sure the change is bounded and you understand the impact, you can make those changes. The more interesting ones, where you start to go, I could change my risk strategy. There's this group of people we're saying no to that perhaps we want to start saying yes to. So then that's a more complicated conversation. And what we would encourage people to do is say, well, think about how you would add that, but don't try and over-engineer it, right? Again, assume that new segment is also going to have to evolve over time, right? So begin with a relatively simple, small subset of those people saying, yes, we're going to go with that, and then gradually increase that bucket over time. One of the nice things about decision models is that they tend to isolate change relatively well. And so you can add a new decision that says, I'm going to decide this new thing about customers based on new data sources or whatever it is. And I don't have to I can say what the boundary looks like and start off with a lot of maybes. And then gradually add sophistication for yeses and nos. And I don't have to change the rest of the model. The rest of the model just expects a yes or no or a maybe. And it's perfectly okay if they all start as maybes or all start as no's. And then gradually you can iterate inside that one piece of the model. So you're not having these ripple effects where every time I make a change, it ripples through the whole system. It just changes that one new piece. And that can be, because to your point, you don't want to try and jump straight to a much more sophisticated strategy. You want to think about this as lots of chunks. And that again is why we really like them to set up a cadence. Because if it's not in this month, it'll be in next month. But I don't fret too much. Or if I look at this month and go, I'm not 100% sure the data supports this change, I'll wait another month. Or a week, whatever it might be, whatever your cadence is. You're not having to wait a year for updates. So then that changes the way people think about it. But it takes a little while. I mean, sometimes it only takes a week to realize they can change it, but sometimes it takes a couple of iterations before people get comfortable that really when you say, if it's not this week, it'll be next week, you really mean it. Because people, most of the systems you work with don't change that fast, right? We've all grown up with IT taking a long time to change them. Particularly if you work in a big bank, right? We're working with one right now, and they're like, well, we've got the annual change for this application is happening in August. It's we have to make sure the decision engine changes on before that or after it, because in August we're changing the underwriting workbench. Nothing else will be done. And so people take a little while to get used to the idea that they can really iterate the decision. But once they do, then you've got lots of options.
I think we have one over here and then over there. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the credit adjudication space, what would you say is the current split between rules-based models and AI ML models? And then the second part is, do you have any suggestions for proving to our risk, approval, Paul's smiling, you know what I mean, our risk partners to approve these AI ML models as we move closer there?
Okay, so great question. So one of the things, one of our sort of rules of thumb is we like to mix and match technologies for a decision. So one of the things about a decision model is it breaks the problem down into pieces, but it doesn't necessarily require you to implement all the pieces the same way. So we're working with a lender right now. Their decision model has dozens of decisions in it, 3 of which are machine learning models. One of which is a calculation that consumes the 3 machine learning models, and then others are rules that say, when can we use the machine learning models, when we're not going to use the machine learning models, what are the absolute conditions that always have to be true no matter what the machine learning model says, And so there's this sort of mix of things, right? So generally, what we see when we start is that the vast majority of an initial credit implementation is going to be rules-based. It's going to be very explicit based on what you do today. And then we encourage people, there's a game we play, we call it the if-only game. So you look at an existing decision model and you say to the risk people or the business people, fill in the blanks in this sentence. If only I knew blank, I would decide differently. They go, oh, well, if only I knew who was going to miss the first payment, because they're fooled. Like, oh, okay, right. So then we go to the machine learning team and say, can you predict how likely it is that an applicant's going to miss their first payment because it was a fraudulent application? And because you're doing it in the context of a decision, you can ask them, well, how accurate would it have to be before you would be willing to decide differently? Because I don't really care how accurate you want the model to be, because you'll say 99% or 99.9%, because that's what you always say. So what I actually want to know is, at what point would you change the decision? Where would you be willing to not auto-approve Paul, but instead send it to manual review because of the risk that he was not going to make the first payment? How accurate would it have to be? What false positive rate would you tolerate? And then you can have a very specific conversation with them, because you all know what the current decision looks like. So that balance is going to be different for everybody in our experience. And what we would say is that it's really hard to get people, a lot of data science teams have I've built a great model and you should use it, is their mindset, right? They go off, they do their research, and they come back with this great model, and they say, hey, this is a great model, and you risk people should use it. And that has a really low success rate, right? There's a reason why people like Gartner and Machine Learning Week will say 80 or 90% of machine learning projects don't work. It's not because they mechanically don't work, they just don't make any difference to the business because they don't get used properly. So for us, we like to start what we say decisions first. What is the decision you make today? What would help you make it better? Can we predict that? Can we build a machine learning that predicts that or not? And then you start to do it. The other thing we found with regulators, because regulators are going to come up, is if you have a decision model, you can say, here's the machine learning model, here's what it calculates, and here's how we use it in the decision. So we can prove to you, for instance, that we never say no to someone because of the machine learning model. All we ever do is send it to manual review. So we might not automatically say yes anymore, but we never say no just because of the machine learning model. And then you can sort of have a discussion whether they're okay with you using the machine learning model, which might be a little black boxy, given that you never say no because of it, right? You can have much more explicit conversations if it's part of an overall strategy. We have one over here. There we go.
So a question on different profiles of customers. You'll have your loan versus your lease, prime, subprime. You can have the consumer be commercial consumer, right? Or the consumer applicant or commercial applicant. So with those layers, is there anything within the decision model that can be crossed between those, or are they very siloed?
Oh, that's great question. One of the reasons we really like it as an approach is precisely because of that kind of challenge, right? If you're trying to do that as a tree, you have a commercial versus consumer, and you're immediately in two different branches of the tree, right? And what we found with decision modeling is that you get a tremendous amount of reuse because it's a network, not a tree, right? So I can have one decision that both sides share, right? So I'll give you a concrete example. We just went through this with a large bank. They had multiple product lines, all of which needed to do an initial credit assessment, and for which each of them had different exceptions. You're new to Canada, you're a thin file, you're a long-time customer, as well as a core, how does the bank decide your creditworthiness decision? And they assumed these were all different. And when we broke it down into essentially building blocks, we had a decision which was, what's the base credit tier that you're in, because of how the bank rates you. And then, are you eligible for this exception, or this exception, or this exception? So we have like 8 or 9 of these exceptions as their own individual decisions. And then what each product line could do is say, I want the main decision and these 3 exceptions. Another one could say, I want the same main decision, but I want a different set of exceptions. So they were able to reuse those exceptions, so you have this sort of like, network of reuse across them. And they had allowed 2 months to develop all the exceptions. And because we had already done the building blocks for other products, it took less than a week. Because we were literally able to say, you're like Lego blocks. You can assemble your set of Lego blocks, and I can assemble my set of Lego blocks, but we've broken it down so that we can share the pieces that matter across the two.
So we probably have time for one more. So we don't have any takers. Maybe I'll finish up with one. Like, so we talked about all the benefits and such. What should people be thinking about in terms of an ongoing investment in the structure of their business if they were to adopt this decision modeling approach? What sort of, once you've kind of come set this up and you've made your way out, are we talking data scientists? Like, what sort of skills are needs?
So we actually had this conversation recently with a client that we just got up and running. And what I would say is there's generally 2 sets of skills that you're going to want to have. You're going to want to have someone, some technical ability to make rule changes, run tests, push them into staging, production, deployment, right? So if you have an IT department, standard IT skills, if you don't, someone on the team is going to need that skill set. We provide that for some customers, but someone's got to have that technical. No matter how business friendly and business oriented your tools are, and many of the good ones are very business friendly. It's not a zero technical effort, right? The other one is like basic business analysis skills, and ability to look at data and say, what's this data telling me? And analyze data using dashboards and BI tools and so on. Because you're going to get this rich set of data, and you're going to want to use it to decide what changes you want to make, but also to see whether you've got the impact you were expecting from the changes you did make. And so those are the 2 key skills, right? And most of our customers, they already have people who obsess about their portfolio. And they've already got people who are in the dashboards, looking at the portfolios, analyzing the data, trying to figure out who's in, who's out, why we're saying this, why we're saying no. So all you're really doing is giving them new data, right? So really it's the little bit of technical skills on the back end. Most of the rest is, once they've gone through the decision modeling exercise, there's a familiarity with the structure that will sustain you until you start making big changes, right? And that's the sum.
Excellent. Sir, always a pleasure.
Nice
Thank
to meet
you.
All right.